Mara Sutton lived on Hawthorne Lane, a quiet street lined with modest homes and trimmed hedges. She worked long hours at the local diner and spent her evenings balancing the chaos of raising two kids on her own. Life wasn't easy, but Mara prided herself on doing her best with what little she had. At the end of the cul-de-sac stood a house that had always seemed a little lonely. The shades were drawn most of the time, the yard was tidy but unremarkable, and its owner rarely ventured outside. That house belonged to Eleanor Green, a woman in her 70s whose husband Arthur had passed away a year and a half ago. Mara often wondered about Eleanor, feeling a quiet sympathy for her. Losing a spouse after decades together must be like losing a part of yourself, she thought. One afternoon, as Mara carried groceries from her car, she caught sight of Eleanor through the kitchen window. The older woman was sitting at her table, staring down at a cup of tea, as if it held all the worries in the world. The sight tugged at Mara's heart. She realized that in all the years they'd been neighbors, she had never really spoken to Eleanor, beyond the occasional wave or polite greeting. Later that week, Mara decided to do something about it. She baked a batch of oatmeal cookies, an old family recipe that her kids adored, and headed over to Eleanor's house. The walk up the front steps felt oddly nerve-wracking, and she hesitated for a moment before knocking. When the door opened, Eleanor looked surprised to see someone standing there. She wore a cardigan that looked a little too big for her, and had the faintest hint of weariness in her eyes. "Hello, Mrs. Green," Mara said brightly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just thought I'd stop by to say hi and bring you these." She held out the tin of cookies. Eleanor blinked, and for a moment Mara wasn't sure how she'd react. Then the older woman's expression softened into a small, grateful smile. "Well, isn't that thoughtful? Please, come in." The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made Mara think of loneliness. The furniture was well kept but dated, and framed photographs adorned every available surface. Eleanor led her to the kitchen, where Mara set the cookies on the counter. They chatted for a while, making small talk about the neighborhood and the weather. Mara told Eleanor about her kids, how her son was starting to take an interest in soccer, and her daughter had recently won a spelling bee. Eleanor listened intently, her smile growing as Mara spoke. "You've got your hands full," Eleanor said, shaking her head in admiration. "I don't know how you do it." "Oh, it's a juggling act, but we manage," Mara replied with a laugh. "And what about you? How are you holding up?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "Some days are better than others. It's hard being in this house alone. Arthur, he kept me busy. Now it just feels like there's too much time and too many things to deal with." Mara nodded, understanding. "I can only imagine how tough it must be. If you ever need anything, someone to talk to, a hand with something, please let me know." Eleanor gave her a grateful look. "That's very kind of you, Mara. Thank you." The conversation flowed more easily after that. Eleanor shared stories about her life with Arthur, the trips they used to take, and the garden he had loved to tend. It was clear that she missed him deeply. Mara couldn't help but think of how Eleanor must feel surrounded by reminders of him every day. Before leaving, Mara glanced out the kitchen window and noticed the garage. The door was slightly ajar, revealing stacks of boxes and what looked like an old workbench. "Looks like your garage could use some attention," she said, gesturing toward it. Eleanor chuckled softly. "That's putting it lightly. Arthur used to be the one to keep it organized, but I've barely stepped foot in there since he passed. Every time I think about cleaning it, I just get overwhelmed." Mara smiled. "How about I help you tackle it? We can take it one step at a time. It might even be fun to see what treasures are hidden in there." Eleanor looked taken aback by the offer, her eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, I couldn't possibly ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm volunteering," Mara said firmly. "We're neighbors. Let me help." After a moment, Eleanor nodded, her smile returning. "All right. I suppose it would be nice to have the company." They agreed to start that weekend. As Mara walked home, she felt a sense of satisfaction she hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't just the act of offering to help, it was the connection she had started to build with Eleanor. That Saturday morning, Mara arrived with gloves, trash bags, and a cheerful determination. Eleanor greeted her with 2 cups of coffee, and they got to work. The garage was a time capsule, filled with decades of memories and forgotten items. Mara found herself fascinated by the stories Eleanor shared about each discovery: a chipped mug that had been a gift from their first anniversary, a box of postcards from trips they had taken, and even Arthur's old bowling shoes. As they worked, the conversation flowed. Mara opened up about her struggles as a single mom, the balancing act of making ends meet while trying to give her kids a good life. Eleanor listened with a compassion that made Mara feel truly seen. By the end of the day, they had cleared a small section of the garage. It didn't look like much, but to Eleanor, it felt like a victory. "Thank you, Mara," she said as they locked up for the day. "I didn't think I'd ever make progress in there, but you've given me hope." "Anytime," Mara replied with a smile. "We'll keep at it until it's done." As she walked home, Mara felt a warmth in her chest. Helping Eleanor wasn't just about the garage, it was about showing her that she wasn't alone. What Mara didn't know was just how much this act of kindness would come to mean, not only for Eleanor but for herself as well. The next Saturday dawned with a bright sun and a gentle breeze, as if nature itself had decided to cheer them on. Mara arrived at Eleanor's house with a sense of purpose. She brought along more trash bags, a broom, and an old folding chair for Eleanor to sit on while they worked. She had also packed a simple lunch of sandwiches and fruit, knowing they'd need a break after a morning of tackling the garage. Eleanor opened the door with a warm smile, looking more lively than Mara had seen her in months. She was wearing a light scarf over her sweater and carried a tray with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "You're too good to me," Eleanor said as Mara stepped inside. "You should be spending your Saturday relaxing, not cleaning out my old junk." Mara shook her head with a laugh. "This is relaxing to me. Besides, who else gets to spend their weekend on a treasure hunt?" When they stepped into the garage, Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the chaotic piles of boxes and mismatched furniture. "It's still such a mess," she murmured. "It's better than it was," Mara said encouragingly. "We've already cleared one corner. Today we'll make more progress, and soon this place will feel like new." They decided to start on a large pile near the back wall, where years of accumulated odds and ends had created a daunting mountain of clutter. As Mara began pulling items from the pile, Eleanor sat on the folding chair, ready to share the stories behind the things they uncovered. The first box contained an assortment of Arthur's old tools: hammers, screwdrivers, and a hand drill that had clearly seen better days. Eleanor's face lit up as she spotted a small, worn tool belt. Arthur wore that every time he worked on something around the house, she said, her voice soft with nostalgia. "He was always fixing things, even if they didn't need fixing. He used to say, 'Better to stay ahead of the wear and tear.'" Mara chuckled as she held up a pair of ancient pliers. "Well, these definitely stayed ahead of the wear and tear. I think these belong in a museum." Eleanor laughed, the sound clear and genuine. It was a laugh that made Mara feel like they were uncovering more than just objects, they were uncovering pieces of Eleanor herself. As the day went on, the pile began to shrink, and they discovered items that brought both laughter and tears. There was a set of Arthur's favorite jazz records, an old chessboard with a few missing pieces, and a dusty photo album filled with pictures of family barbecues and vacations. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I'd forgotten about these," she said quietly. "Look, that was our first trip to the Grand Canyon. Arthur insisted on driving the whole way, even though I offered to take over. He loved being behind the wheel." Mara leaned over to study the photograph of a younger Eleanor and Arthur standing at the edge of the canyon, their faces radiant with happiness. "You look so happy," Mara said. "We were," Eleanor replied with a wistful smile. Arthur had this way of making even the simplest moments feel special. He could find joy in anything. By lunchtime, they had cleared a significant portion of the garage. Mara spread out a blanket on the driveway, and they sat in the sun, eating sandwiches and sipping tea. The warmth of the afternoon seemed to wrap around them, and for a while they simply enjoyed the peace of the moment. "You know," Eleanor said after a long silence, "I never thought I'd find myself sitting in my driveway, laughing and reminiscing like this. It feels good. Like I've been given a second chance to appreciate these memories." "You deserve that," Mara said sincerely. "Sometimes it just takes a little help to see the good things again." Eleanor reached out and patted Mara's hand. "You're a good person, Mara. I don't think I've told you that enough." Mara felt her cheeks flush. "You've told me plenty. But thank you." Over the next few weeks, they continued their Saturday routine. Each visit brought new discoveries, not only in the garage but in their growing friendship. Mara learned that Eleanor had once dreamed of opening a small cafe with Arthur, where they would serve coffee and homemade pastries. She learned that Eleanor had a soft spot for birds, especially robins, and that Arthur used to build birdhouses for her as anniversary gifts. Eleanor, in turn, became a confidant for Mara. She listened as Mara talked about the challenges of being a single mother, how she stretched every dollar, worried about giving her kids the opportunities they deserved, and tried to balance work with parenting. Eleanor offered words of encouragement. But more than that, she offered understanding. "You're doing more than enough," Eleanor said one day as they sorted through a box of holiday decorations. "Your children see how hard you work for them. That kind of love stays with them forever." By the time they finished cleaning the garage, it was barely recognizable. The clutter was gone, replaced by neatly arranged shelves and labeled bins. Eleanor's birdhouses hung on one wall, freshly dusted and ready to be put to use. The tools were organized on a pegboard, and the floor had been swept clean. On their final Saturday in the garage, Eleanor stood in the center of the space, turning in a slow circle as she took it all in. "I can't believe we did it," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's perfect." Mara smiled. "It's more than perfect, it's yours again." Eleanor nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you, Mara, for everything. You've brought so much light back into my life." Mara shook her head. "You've done the same for me, Eleanor. Helping you has been one of the best things to happen to me in a long time." As they locked up the garage and stepped out into the fading sunlight, Mara felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The garage project might have been finished, but her connection with Eleanor was just beginning. Neither of them could have guessed how much more this bond would come to mean in the days ahead. Winter crept into the neighborhood with a quiet chill, the trees now bare and the sidewalks dusted with frost. Even as the season changed, Mara and Eleanor's newfound friendship remained steady. Without the garage project to keep them busy, they shifted their Saturday routine to indoor activities. Eleanor had invited Mara over for tea and conversation, and on occasion, they baked together, filling the house with the warmth of cinnamon and sugar. One Saturday afternoon, Eleanor surprised Mara by pulling a weathered wooden box from her hall closet. It was small and unassuming, but the way Eleanor held it suggested it carried something important. "I thought you might like to help me with this," Eleanor said, setting the box on the dining room table. "What's in it?" Mara asked. "Old letters, photos, and a few keepsakes," Eleanor replied, her smile tinged with nostalgia. "Arthur and I used to call it our memory box. Whenever we found something special, we'd tuck it in here." Mara's curiosity piqued, and she sat beside Eleanor as the older woman opened the lid. Inside were stacks of envelopes tied with ribbon, faded photographs, and small trinkets that seemed to whisper stories of the past. Eleanor picked up a photograph of a young couple sitting on a park bench, laughing at something out of frame. She traced the edges of the photo with her fingers, her expression soft. "That was the day Arthur proposed," she said. "He didn't have a ring, couldn't afford one at the time, but he promised me we'd get one someday. I told him I didn't care about a ring as long as we were together." Mara smiled, touched by the story. "That's beautiful, Eleanor. The way you talk about Arthur. It's clear how much you loved each other." "We did," Eleanor said quietly. "I miss him every day. But having you around has made the days a little brighter. It reminds me that there's still joy to be found, even after loss." As they sorted through the memory box, Eleanor shared more stories about her life with Arthur. Mara listened intently, feeling honored to be entrusted with such cherished memories. At one point, Eleanor pulled out a delicate silver locket and opened it to reveal a tiny photograph of a baby. "That's our daughter, Clara," Eleanor said, her voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "I didn't know you had a daughter," Mara said gently. Eleanor nodded. "We lost her when she was very young. It was the hardest thing we ever went through, but Arthur and I leaned on each other. He used to say that Clara would always be with us, watching over us. This locket was his way of keeping her close." Mara reached out and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." "It was," Eleanor said, her eyes glistening. "But life has a way of moving forward, even when you think it can't. I've learned to carry the love we had for her with me, just as I carry Arthur's." Their afternoons together became a cherished ritual, and Mara began to notice subtle changes in Eleanor. She seemed more at ease, her laugh coming more freely and her steps a little lighter. She even began venturing out of the house more often, joining Mara for walks through the neighborhood or trips to the local cafe. One Saturday, Eleanor mentioned she had been thinking about picking up painting again, something she had loved in her youth but had let fall by the wayside. "Arthur always encouraged me to try new things," she said as they browsed through the art supplies aisle of the local craft store. "I think he'd want me to give this another go." Mara grinned. "I think he'd be thrilled. Let's get you some supplies and see what happens." Eleanor's first attempts were hesitant, but over time she began to find her rhythm. Mara would visit and find Eleanor sitting at her dining room table, paintbrush in hand, surrounded by vibrant landscapes and delicate floral designs. "You're a natural," Mara said one afternoon, admiring a painting of a field of daisies. Eleanor laughed. "Hardly. But it feels good to create something again. It's like I'm reconnecting with a part of myself I'd forgotten about." Through it all, Mara continued to share her own struggles and triumphs. She talked about how her son was improving in school, how her daughter had won another spelling bee, and how she was saving up for a small family vacation. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, offering advice and encouragement when Mara needed it most. "You're doing a wonderful job with those kids," Eleanor said one evening as they sipped tea by the fire. "They're lucky to have you." Mara smiled, grateful for the validation. "Thank you, Eleanor. That means a lot." As winter turned to spring, their friendship blossomed in ways neither had expected. Eleanor often said that Mara's presence had brought new life into her home, but Mara felt the same way about Eleanor. She hadn't realized how much she had needed a friend like Eleanor, someone who could remind her of life's beauty even in the face of challenges. One day, as they sat on Eleanor's porch enjoying the mild spring air, Eleanor turned to Mara with a thoughtful expression. "You've given me so much, Mara," she said. "More than you realize. I've been thinking about how I can repay you." Mara shook her head. "Eleanor, you don't owe me anything. Your friendship is more than enough." Eleanor smiled, her eyes sparkling with a mix of mischief and affection. "We'll see about that." Mara laughed, not thinking much of it. She couldn't have known then that Eleanor had plans that would soon change her life forever. Late in June, Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep. Mara received the news early in the morning from Beth, the neighbor across the street. Though she had known this day would come, the loss felt heavier than she had expected. Eleanor had become such an integral part of her life, a source of quiet joy and wisdom, and now that warmth was gone. The memorial service was held the following weekend at a small, sunlit chapel on the outskirts of town. Mara arrived early, unsure of what to expect. She had assumed it would be a modest gathering, but as she walked inside she was surprised to see a larger crowd than she anticipated. Among the attendees were a few faces she didn't recognize, including a couple in their 50s and a man about Mara's age who stood near the front with an air of quiet solemnity. As Mara took her seat near the middle of the chapel, the older woman turned and gave her a polite smile. She had Eleanor's sharp green eyes and carried herself with a quiet grace that immediately reminded Mara of her late friend. The service began with a simple hymn, followed by heartfelt eulogies that painted a vivid picture of Eleanor's life. The man Mara didn't know, who introduced himself as David, Eleanor's great-nephew, spoke first. He recounted his childhood visits to Eleanor's house, remembering her as a woman who always had a jar of cookies on the counter and a story to share. She never had children of her own after losing her daughter, David said, his voice tinged with emotion, but she loved fiercely, and she had a way of making everyone feel special. Even after Arthur passed, she carried that love with her. She was the kind of person who quietly made the world better. When Mara stood to speak, her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. "I didn't know Eleanor for as long as some of you," she began, her voice soft but clear. "But in the time we shared, she became one of the most important people in my life. She taught me how to slow down and appreciate the little things. She reminded me that even when life feels hard, there's beauty to be found in kindness and connection. I'll always be grateful for her friendship." As Mara returned to her seat, the woman with Eleanor's green eyes reached out to touch her arm. "You must be Mara," she whispered. "I'm Helen, Eleanor's niece. She spoke of you often in her letters." Mara felt a pang of surprise. "She did." Helen nodded, her eyes soft with gratitude. "She adored you. You brought so much joy back into her life." After the service, Mara lingered outside the chapel, hesitant to leave. Helen and David approached her, and the three began to talk. Helen explained that while Eleanor had kept in touch with her family through letters and phone calls, they hadn't been able to visit often due to living in different states. "It means so much to us that she had you nearby," Helen said, her voice warm. "She wasn't alone in her final years, and that's a comfort we'll always hold on to." Mara felt a swell of emotion. "She wasn't just a neighbor to me. She was family." Helen smiled and hugged Mara briefly. "That's how she saw you too." 2 days after the service, Mara received a phone call from Robert Davis, an attorney handling Eleanor's estate. "Ms. Sutton," he began, his voice calm and professional. "I've been trying to reach you regarding Mrs. Green's will. She specifically named you as a beneficiary, and I'd like to arrange a meeting to go over the details." Mara's breath caught. I didn't know Eleanor had included me in her will. Are you sure?" "Quite sure," Robert replied. "If you're available, I'd be happy to explain everything in person." The next afternoon, Mara found herself sitting in a quiet, wood-paneled office. Across from her, Robert laid out a folder containing Eleanor's will and a series of financial documents. Mrs. Green was more financially secure than most people realized, Robert began. She lived modestly, but she and her late husband, Arthur, made several wise investments during their lifetime. Her estate is quite substantial. Mara's eyes widened, but she remained silent, unsure of what to expect. "Most of the estate, including the majority of her savings and the house, will go to her immediate family," Robert continued. "However, Mrs. Green also left a specific provision for you. She wanted you to receive $150,000. Mara stared at him, stunned. $150,000, she whispered. Robert nodded. "She mentioned in her will that you were a dear friend who made her final years brighter. She wanted to express her gratitude by easing some of the financial burdens you've faced." Mara's hands trembled as she processed the news. "I don't even know what to say," she said softly. Robert smiled kindly. "Mrs. Green spoke very highly of you. This was her way of ensuring that your kindness didn't go unnoticed. I'll guide you through the process of accessing the funds. There's no rush, take your time." Mara left the office in a daze, clutching an envelope containing the documents Robert had given her. That evening, After putting her children to bed, she sat at the kitchen table and opened a handwritten note from Eleanor included in the paperwork. Dear Mara, if you're reading this, I hope you'll understand why I made this decision. You gave me the gift of friendship, of laughter and light, at a time when I thought my life had grown small. Your kindness reminded me of all the good still left in the world, and for that I will always be grateful. I know life hasn't always been easy for you, and I hope this gift will make things a little easier. Use it however you see fit, whether it's for your children, your home, or yourself. You deserve happiness and security, and I'm so proud to have known you. With love and gratitude. Eleanor. Mara read the note twice, her eyes brimming with tears. Eleanor's generosity was overwhelming, but more than the money, it was the love behind the gesture that left Mara speechless. She folded the letter carefully and held it to her chest, whispering a quiet promise to honor Eleanor's memory by living a life filled with the same kindness and compassion Eleanor had shown her. Mara awoke the next morning with a strange mix of emotions. The memory of Eleanor's letter stayed with her, a bittersweet reminder of how deeply her late neighbor had cared for her. As the reality of Eleanor's gift sank in, Mara felt an immense sense of gratitude, but also a quiet resolve to use the money in a way that would honor her friend's wishes. The first thing Mara did was take a quiet walk through the neighborhood, reflecting on all the moments she and Eleanor had shared. She passed Eleanor's house, its windows shuttered and the garden slightly overgrown now. For a moment she stood at the edge of the driveway, thinking of the afternoons they had spent laughing and uncovering memories in the garage. That evening after dinner, Mara sat down with her children at the kitchen table. She had decided it was time to share the news, though she kept the details simple. I want to tell you both something important, she began, her voice calm but full of emotion. You remember Miss Eleanor, don't you? Her son nodded, and her daughter smiled. She always gave us cookies, Emma said fondly. Well, Miss Eleanor did something very kind for us before she passed away. She left us some money, a lot of money to help us. She wanted to make sure we'd be okay. Both children stared at her, wide-eyed. How much, her son asked. It's enough to make things a little easier, Mara said with a smile. But more importantly, it's a reminder of how much kindness can change someone's life. Eleanor wanted us to have a better future, and I want us to honor her by making the most of it. Over the next few weeks, Mara began to put Eleanor's gift to good use. First, she paid off the debts that had weighed on her for years. It was a relief to no longer feel the constant stress of overdue bills and stretched paychecks. With the remaining money, she made a series of thoughtful decisions, setting aside savings for her children's future, making much-needed repairs to their small house, and finally planning a family vacation, a promise she had made to herself long ago. The changes weren't dramatic or showy, but they brought a steady sense of security that Mara hadn't felt in years. She started working fewer hours at the diner, giving her more time to spend with her kids. She began volunteering at a local community center, inspired by Eleanor's example of generosity. One afternoon, as she walked through the town square, she passed the small art supply shop where she and Eleanor had once bought paints and brushes. On impulse, she stepped inside and picked out a set of beginner supplies. That evening, after the kids were asleep, she set up a small easel in the corner of her living room and began to paint for the first time since childhood. The act felt like a quiet tribute to Eleanor, a way of continuing the thread of creativity and joy her friend had inspired. Over time, Mara's painting became a source of peace and self-expression. She even began to share her work with friends and neighbors, who encouraged her to keep going. On what would have been Eleanor's birthday, Mara and her children visited the cemetery with a bouquet of Eleanor's favorite flowers, white daisies, and a small wooden birdhouse they had painted together. They placed the flowers on her grave and hung the birdhouse in a nearby tree. As they stood there, Mara spoke softly, as if Eleanor could still hear her. Thank you, Eleanor, for everything. You didn't just change my life, you reminded me of how much beauty and kindness there is in the world. I promise to keep sharing that with others. From that day forward, Mara carried Eleanor's spirit with her in everything she did. She became a source of support for others in her community, always quick to lend a hand or offer a kind word. Whenever life felt overwhelming, she would think of Eleanor's gentle smile and the quiet strength she had shown in her later years. Eleanor's gift wasn't just the money, it was the reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives in ways no one could predict. And for Mara, it was a lesson she would carry with her always, passing it down to her children and everyone lucky enough to know her. Eleanor had left the world, but her legacy lived on in the love and hope she had given, proving that even after death, a kind heart could still light the way for others.